So this is a grand day to be huddled up here close to this fire with a hot pot of coffee on and tell a little history by the hearth, or as I like to say, a wee bit of history. And this may sound odd, but I'm going to start by reading a poem. And Walt Whitman was always my favorite poet from the 1800s, and well, my favorite poet periods. Anyway, it's quite a short one, so bear with me. It's when I heard the learned astronomer. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures, the range in columns before me, when I had been shown the charts and the diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I sitting heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause from the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself into the mystical, moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. If my kids happen to watch this episode, they're going to get quite a kick out of that, because I used to read them Walt Whitman on long car rides and drive them actually crazy. But something took, because occasionally they'll actually quote them. Anyway, the reason I'm reading that today is I'm a firm believer that if one wants to experience something, you're better off to experience it firsthand. So if we think about academia, I mean, it's wonderful and it's great, but people can become authorities with never leaving that lecture hall. But to stand in the footsteps or follow in the footsteps of our pioneer ancestors that went before us, that adds a whole new element to it. An example would be someone who studies American Civil War. If they've never stood, let's say, on the battlefield of Gettysburg, and stood where Pickett was when he ordered 12,500 rebel soldiers to march up that upward sloping open fields to Cemetery Ridge. When you're there, and I've been there numerous times, but when you stand in that location or similar locations, battlefields, historic sites, you can actually, in that case, you'd hear the rebel yell. You'd smell the acrid smell of the black powder in the air. You'd hear the screams of agony of the wounded. It adds a whole new element to history. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you a wee bit of history about a journey that Cathy and I made where we followed the explorer Alexander MacKenzie on his famous trip up what would become known as the Mackenzie River. And yeah, I think you'll find it fascinating. It's too long to put all in one, so I'm going to break it into another part somewhere down the road. I'll talk about other adventures of Alexander MacKenzie, but I'm going to focus specifically on the trip that Cathy and I took, which was the Mackenzie River. Before I get into the historic aspect of canoeing the Mackenzie River, allow me to paint a picture of the trip that Cathy and I took. So the Mackenzie River is the second longest river in North America, second only to the Mississippi. It's 1,800 kilometers long, so about 1,200 miles, approximately 1,200 miles. It ends up in the Beaufort Sea or the Arctic Ocean, which is where Cathy and I ultimately ended up. We started in Hay River. We had to paddle about 80 kilometers of Great Slave Lake. Now the ice in Great Slave Lake often doesn't go out till mid-June or so, and the river's free of ice from, ice goes in October, it doesn't go out till May on the river itself proper, at least in spots. It's a massive river in terms of width. Most spots it's 2 miles across. Many parts of it are 4 to 5, and there are even portions of it that are 10 miles across or 16 kilometers. So, you know, it's like a huge lake. You can hardly see the other side. It's very fast. It actually drains 13% of the land mass of Canada. And if you think about the size of our country, second largest in the world, its drainage area is that of the size of Mexico. So that sort of paints the picture. A lot of our trip was north of the Arctic Circle. Weather conditions could go from freezing cold in the morning to blazing hot by midday to horizontal blizzard of snow in the afternoon. So quite fickle weather conditions, and that's the trip we ventured off on. We were 46 camps in the river, so 6 weeks in total. We had anticipated more than that. We took 9 weeks supply of food on this trip. And we ended up in the Beaufort Sea in the Arctic Ocean. So anyway, a very memorable trip indeed. Now on to Alexander MacKenzie. So our good friends and neighbors to the south, they have their own story that's comparable to the one I'm going to tell, and that would be the Lewis and Clark expedition, or their Corps of Discovery, which ventures off in 1804. They do a round trip. They're back by September 1806. And they've mapped this massive gray area that exists in central part of the states. The Louisiana Purchase has taken place, and America has doubled its landmass size overnight. And these fellows are tasked with finding, these two men are tasked with finding a route, ideally a water route that would end up at the Pacific, which would lend itself to commerce, trade, and everything else, and a scientific exploration, etc., and report back to Thomas Jefferson, who's the president at the time. However, my wee bit of history today, it precedes that massive undertaking by 16 years, and that brings me to our friend Alexander MacKenzie. So a very young Alexander MacKenzie arrives in the British colonies and goes to New York City. He's there for a spell, and then they decide to send him to Montreal to advance his education. And it's at that point that Mackenzie joins the Northwest Trade Company. So if we think about the Hudson Bay Company, they got the charter to Rupert's Land in 1670, I believe the charter was issued, which gave them sole trading rights for all the lands that drained into the Hudson Bay. So 3.9 million square kilometers of land. The Northwest Company, which is their rival now, they have to basically, they flank them in this big sweeping arch, and they have to go west and northwest. And young Mackenzie, he's seen as the rising star of the company. So in 1789, he's picked to head this expedition to try to find a waterway to the ocean. And we know from the west coast, the Pacific coast, if you would, of Canada has all been mapped now, very thoroughly mapped, in fact. But we don't know how to get there. It's this big gray area, just similar to Lewis and Clark had. So he gets Dene Indians as guides, the local nation, if you would, of indigenous peoples that guide him. And ironically, we name it the Mackenzie River, but they were using this for 10,000 years. He didn't really find anything, and they guided him to the Arctic Ocean. So he leaves Fort Chipewyan. It's a journey of 5,000 miles. He does it in 102 days. So he really pushes his crew. And they arrive at the Beaufort Sea, the same place Cathy and I did. But instead of being elated, he realizes this isn't the Pacific Ocean, this is the Arctic Ocean. What earthly good is that to me? And privately, although it's called the Mackenzie River, the natives call it De-Chu, which just literally means big river, translated into Dene, or from Dene to English. But privately, Mackenzie calls it Disappointment River, because it didn't get him to the Pacific Ocean. So getting back from that trip, now he knows that on the Pacific, along the Alaskan coast at that time, the Russians are trading, and the Russians have a big demand for furs, and he wants to capitalize. His objective is to find this waterway, or a course of least resistance, if you would, similar to Lewis and Clark, to the Pacific Ocean. So he realizes that from his first trip on the Mackenzie River that his cartography skills are really lacking. He's doing a lot of dead reckoning, and he's pretty bad at map making. So he takes a furlough. He heads back to England, London, England, and he studies cartography. He learns to become very proficient at determining latitude and longitude. And he heads back to North America, to the Northwest Trade Company, back out to Fort Chipewyan. And in 1793, he makes his expedition. And that's where I'm going to end my story today, because that in itself is another story, and it's going to take some time to tell that. But that trip that Cathy and I did, again, the fact that we followed his footsteps, and when you're there thinking, are we camped where they were camped? And the topography, the wildlife we saw musk oxen. We paddled up to small cub wolves that were playing tug of war on the shoreline. We saw peregrine falcons, moose, grizzly bear, black bear. And we went through an area where we've sort of started in blackberry country, through grizzly country, Arctic wolves, of course, and we end up in polar bear country. Anyway, that was our expedition. That was Mackenzie's expedition, and I'm going to get back to weaving my sash here, because this is for a friend out in the East Coast. My wife's going to be heading out there, and I got to get this gift finished for him.